The lunch bell had just rung at Riverside High School when 3 senior boys cornered the quiet substitute teacher near the trophy case. What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter everything these bullies thought they knew about power, respect, and consequences. Emma Chun had been minding her own business, reviewing lesson plans for her afternoon chemistry class, when Jake Morrison and his crew decided she looked like an easy target. They had no idea they were about to meet someone who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of controlled violence. The sound of Jake hitting the floor echoed through the hallway like a thunderclap, his overconfident smirk replaced by a look of pure shock as he found himself face down on the linoleum, his arm twisted at an angle that suggested any sudden movement would result in a very unpleasant snap. His 2 accomplices, Ryan Taylor and Connor Davis, stood frozen against the lockers, their earlier bravado evaporating as they watched their seemingly invincible leader reduced to a whimpering mess by someone they had dismissed as just another pushover substitute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Chun had arrived at Riverside High School 3 weeks earlier, with nothing more than a worn leather messenger bag and a reputation for being unremarkably quiet. The hallways of this suburban Ohio institution buzzed with the typical energy of a school where Friday night football games drew larger crowds than most professional sporting events, and where the social hierarchy was as rigid as the periodic table she taught in her temporary chemistry classroom. Students barely glanced her way as she navigated between classes, her small frame and soft-spoken demeanor making her nearly invisible among the chaos of teenage drama and academic pressures. The staff lounge conversations she overheard painted a picture of a school district struggling with the delicate balance between academic excellence and athletic supremacy. Budget cuts had forced the administration to rely heavily on substitute teachers for subjects that weren't directly related to maintaining their championship football program, and Emma found herself filling in for a chemistry teacher who had left mid-semester due to what the administration diplomatically called personal reasons. The reality, as whispered among the faculty, was that Mrs. Patterson had grown tired of being treated as a second-class citizen in an institution that measured success primarily in touchdowns and scholarship offers. Emma's daily routine was methodical and unobtrusive. She arrived each morning at 7:30, prepared her lessons with the same precision she had once applied to perfecting her forms at the Dragon's Path martial arts studio across town, and conducted her classes with a gentle firmness that somehow managed to keep even the most disruptive students engaged. Her colleagues in the science department appreciated her thoroughness, though they often remarked on how she seemed to fade into the background during faculty meetings, never raising her voice or drawing attention to herself. What none of them knew was that Emma's quiet demeanor was the result of years of discipline that extended far beyond the classroom. Every morning before school, she still visited Master Liu Wei at the Dragon's Path studio, maintaining the rigorous training regimen that had once made her one of the most feared competitors in regional Taekwondo tournaments. The injury that had ended her competitive career 2 years earlier had healed physically, but the emotional wounds of watching her Olympic dreams dissolve had left her seeking a different kind of purpose. Teaching had become her way of channeling the same focus and dedication that had driven her martial arts career, though she kept that part of her life carefully separate from her professional identity. The students saw her as Miss Chun, the quiet substitute who explained chemical reactions with patience and clarity. They had no reason to suspect that the same hands that demonstrated proper lab safety techniques were capable of delivering strikes that could drop a grown man in seconds. The social dynamics at Riverside High School operated according to an unspoken but universally understood hierarchy. At the apex sat the football team, led by senior captain Jake Morrison, whose family name adorned the newly renovated athletic facilities, thanks to his father's construction company donations. Jake moved through the hallways with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, his letter jacket serving as both armor and advertisement for his untouchable status within the school ecosystem. His inner circle consisted of Ryan Taylor, whose basketball skills had earned him a similar level of protection from administrative scrutiny, and Connor Davis, a wannabe tough guy whose primary qualification for membership in their exclusive club was his willingness to laugh at Jake's jokes and participate in whatever scheme the group devised to assert their dominance over lesser mortals. Together, they formed a trinity of adolescent arrogance that had terrorized underclassmen, intimidated teachers, and created an atmosphere of fear that permeated every corner of the school. The administration's relationship with these boys was complicated by factors that extended far beyond typical teenage misbehavior. Principal Derek Hoffman had built his career on the success of Riverside's athletic programs, and his contract renewal depended heavily on maintaining the district's reputation as a pipeline for college scholarships and state championships. When incidents involving star athletes threatened to disrupt this delicate balance, they were typically handled through quiet conversations and creative disciplinary measures that avoided any permanent marks on transcripts or eligibility records. Emma had observed this dynamic during her brief tenure at the school, noting how certain students seemed to operate under different rules than their peers. She had witnessed Jake's group engaging in behavior that would have resulted in immediate suspension for other students, only to see them walking the halls the next day with nothing more than what appeared to be mild warnings from teachers who seemed more concerned with avoiding confrontation than addressing misconduct. The faculty lounge conversations often touched on these frustrations, though always in hushed tones and with careful attention to who might be listening. Ms. Sarah Kim, the art teacher who had become Emma's closest colleague during her short time at Riverside, had shared stories of previous incidents that had been swept under the administrative rug, creating a culture where students learned that connections and athletic ability could serve as shields against accountability. This environment had created a dangerous sense of invincibility among Jake's group, who had grown increasingly bold in their treatment of staff members they perceived as vulnerable. Substitute teachers, in particular, had become frequent targets of their intimidation tactics, with several requesting transfers to other districts rather than continue dealing with the hostile atmosphere that seemed to follow these boys wherever they went. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emma's first direct encounter with Jake Morrison had occurred during her second week at the school, when he had entered her chemistry class 15 minutes late and proceeded to disrupt her lesson with a series of increasingly inappropriate comments about her appearance and teaching methods. She had handled the situation with the same calm professionalism she applied to all classroom management issues, but she had noticed the way other students seemed to shrink in their seats, unwilling to make eye contact or offer support in the face of Jake's verbal assault. The incident had been reported to the administration through proper channels, but the response had been predictably tepid. Principal Hoffman had assured Emma that the matter would be addressed, but Jake's behavior in subsequent classes suggested that any conversation between the two had been more of a formality than a genuine attempt at correction. If anything, Jake seemed emboldened by his apparent immunity from consequences, his smirk growing more pronounced each time their paths crossed. In the hallway, Emma's training had taught her to recognize predatory behavior long before it escalated into physical confrontation. The way Jake's group positioned themselves in doorways, their habit of blocking pathways while engaged in seemingly innocent conversations, and their tendency to invade personal space during interactions, were all tactics she had encountered in various forms throughout her competitive career. The difference was that in tournament settings, such behavior was met with immediate and decisive responses from officials who understood the importance of maintaining boundaries and respect. The school environment, however, operated under different Rules, where the threat of violence was often more powerful than violence itself, and where victims were expected to endure harassment rather than risk, escalating situations that might reflect poorly on the institution's reputation. Emma had initially assumed that her role as a temporary faculty member was to maintain order within her classroom while avoiding any unnecessary confrontations that might complicate her employment status. This philosophical approach had served her well during the first few weeks of her assignment, allowing her to focus on delivering quality education while staying below the radar of both administrative attention and student antagonism. Her chemistry classes had developed a reputation for being both informative and peaceful, a rare combination in a school where chaos often seemed to be the default state of existence. The gradual escalation of Jake's behavior toward her had been subtle enough that she might have missed it if not for her training in reading body language and recognizing threat patterns. What had begun as mild classroom disruptions had evolved into more personal forms of harassment, including comments about her appearance, speculation about her personal life, and increasingly bold attempts to test her boundaries and gauge her responses to provocation. Emma had documented each incident with the methodical precision that characterized all aspects of her professional life, creating a paper trail that she hoped would provide protection if the situation continued to deteriorate. However, her reports seemed to disappear into an administrative black hole, generating nothing more than vague promises of investigation and polite suggestions that she try to build better rapport with difficult students. The other faculty members had begun to take notice of Jake's fixation on the quiet substitute teacher, though their responses varied considerably based on their own experiences with the administration's handling of similar situations. Some offered quiet words of support and encouragement, while others seemed to view her situation as an inevitable consequence of challenging the established order within the school's social hierarchy. Miss Sarah Kim had been the most direct in her warnings about the potential dangers of crossing Jake Morrison and his family, sharing stories of previous teachers who had found themselves transferred to less desirable positions after filing complaints against star athletes. The message was clear: survival in this environment required a careful balance between maintaining professional standards and avoiding conflicts that might threaten the delicate ecosystem that kept the athletic programs functioning smoothly. Emma's martial arts background had instilled in her a deep understanding of the difference between avoiding conflict and enabling aggression. Master Liu Wei had taught her that true strength often required standing firm in the face of intimidation, while wisdom demanded careful consideration of when and how to apply that strength. The philosophy that guided her training emphasized restraint and precision, using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats while maintaining control over both the situation and her own emotional responses. As Jake's behavior grew more brazen, Emma found herself drawing upon these teachings to maintain her composure while carefully observing the patterns and motivations driving his escalating harassment. She recognized the classic signs of a predator: testing boundaries, looking for signs of weakness or vulnerability that could be exploited for personal gratification or social dominance. The other students in her classes had begun to watch these interactions with a mixture of fascination and horror, clearly aware that they were witnessing something significant, but uncertain about what form the inevitable confrontation might take. Some seemed to be silently rooting for their quiet teacher to find a way to put Jake in his place, while others appeared resigned to watching another faculty member become a casualty of the school's dysfunctional power structure. Emma's evening training sessions at the Dragon's Path studio had become increasingly important during this period, providing both physical outlet and mental clarity as she processed the challenges of her current assignment. Master Liu Wei had noticed the tension in her movements and the distraction in her focus, leading to conversations about the practical application of martial arts principles in civilian life situations where physical confrontation was not the primary solution. These discussions had reinforced Emma's commitment to handling the Jake Morrison situation through appropriate channels while maintaining her readiness to protect herself if those channels proved inadequate. She had no desire to jeopardize her teaching career or create unnecessary drama, but neither was she willing to become another victim of a system that seemed designed to protect aggressors at the expense of their targets. The morning of the incident had begun like any other, with Emma arriving early to prepare for her classes and review the lesson plans that would guide her students through the intricacies of chemical bonding and molecular structures. The chemistry lab was her sanctuary within the school, a place where logic and precision ruled supreme, and where she could temporarily forget about the social dynamics that made other aspects of her job so challenging. Her first 3 classes of the day had proceeded smoothly, with students showing genuine interest in the material and participating in discussions with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded her why she had chosen education as her post-competition career path. Even the typically disruptive elements seemed more focused than usual, perhaps sensing that their teacher possessed qualities that extended beyond what was immediately visible on the surface. The lunch period had always been Emma's time to decompress and prepare for the afternoon sessions, usually spent in the quiet corner of the faculty lounge where she could review notes and enjoy a few minutes of peace before diving back into the controlled chaos of teenage education. On this particular day, she had decided to take a different route through the school, partly to stretch her legs and partly to familiarize herself with areas of the building she rarely visited during her normal routine. The trophy case near the main entrance had caught her attention, its gleaming contents telling the story of Riverside High School's athletic achievements over the decades. Football dominated the display, with championship trophies and team photographs, creating a shrine to the program that defined the school's identity in the community. Basketball, wrestling, and track had smaller sections, but the message was clear about what mattered most in this institution. Emma was examining a photograph of the current football team when she became aware of footsteps approaching from behind, followed by the kind of hushed conversation that usually preceded trouble. She recognized Jake Morrison's voice even before turning around, along with the distinctive laughs of Ryan Taylor and Connor Davis as they approached with the swagger that had become their trademark throughout the school. Jake Morrison embodied everything wrong with privilege unchecked by accountability. At 18 years old, he stood 6 feet 2 inches of manufactured confidence, his leather jacket stretched across shoulders that had never carried real responsibility despite their impressive breadth. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled, maintained by expensive products purchased with allowance money that exceeded most teachers' weekly salaries. The Morrison name carried weight in Millbrook not just because of financial contributions to the school district, but because David Morrison's construction company had built half the commercial developments in the county over the past 15 years. The family's influence extended far beyond simple monetary donations. David Morrison sat on the Chamber of Commerce, had golf relationships with 3 of the 5 school board members, and his wife Linda commanded the Parent-Teacher Association. With the same authoritarian efficiency that had made her husband's business empire successful, their dinner table conversations revolved around maintaining the family's reputation and ensuring that nothing threatened Jake's path to a Division I football scholarship, which they viewed less as an educational opportunity and more as the next logical step in building the Morrison legacy. Jake had absorbed these lessons about power and influence from an early age, watching his parents navigate social and political situations with the calculated precision of chess masters. He learned that problems could be solved with the right combination of money, connections, and strategic pressure applied at vulnerable points. By the time he reached high school, these concepts had transformed into a worldview where consequences were theoretical concepts that applied to other people, not to those smart enough or well-connected enough to avoid them. His inner circle reflected this philosophy perfectly. Ryan Taylor brought athletic credibility through his basketball achievements, but more importantly, he provided validation for Jake's belief that exceptional talent justified exceptional treatment. Ryan's family owned the largest car dealership in the county, making him a valuable ally whose parents could be counted on to support the Morrison perspective during any controversy that might arise. Connor Davis served a different function, acting as the group's designated enforcer for situations that required physical intimidation without the sophisticated maneuvering that Jake preferred to employ. The trio had refined their intimidation tactics over 4 years of high school, developing an arsenal of psychological and social weapons that allowed them to maintain control without leaving evidence that might trigger administrative intervention. They understood instinctively that outright violence would create problems, but calculated harassment, strategic humiliation, and sustained psychological pressure could achieve the same results while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Their favorite targets were temporary faculty members who lacked the institutional relationships necessary to defend themselves effectively. Substitute teachers represented perfect victims because they possessed just enough authority to make their subjugation satisfying, while lacking the job security that might encourage them to fight back aggressively. The boys had perfected a campaign strategy that began with minor classroom disruptions, escalated through personal boundary violations, and culminated in public humiliation designed to either force their targets into submission or drive them away entirely. Emma Chun had initially appeared to fit their preferred victim profile perfectly. She was small, quiet, and obviously temporary, with none of the swagger or institutional backing that might indicate dangerous resistance to their campaign. Her careful professionalism and measured responses to their early provocations had been interpreted as weakness rather than discipline, encouraging them to believe that she would crumble under sustained pressure, just like her predecessors had done. Jake's fascination with Emma had grown beyond simple dominance games into something more personal and disturbing. He found her composure infuriating precisely because it seemed authentic rather than fearful, suggesting an inner strength that challenged his assumptions about power dynamics. Her refusal to be rattled by his classroom antics had transformed what should have been a routine intimidation exercise into a more complex psychological challenge that engaged his competitive instincts. The other students had begun to notice Jake's fixation on their substitute chemistry teacher, creating an undercurrent of anticipation throughout the school as everyone waited to see how the inevitable confrontation would unfold. Some hoped secretly that Miss Chun would find a way to resist Jake's harassment, while others seemed resigned to watching another teacher become collateral damage in the ongoing war between student entitlement and educational authority. The administration's response to Emma's documented reports about Jake's behavior had been predictably inadequate, following patterns established through years of similar situations. Principal Derek Hoffman had built his career on maintaining the delicate balance between educational standards and athletic success, which meant that disciplinary actions against star athletes required careful consideration of multiple factors beyond simple rule violations. Hoffman's office meetings with Jake typically resembled diplomatic negotiations rather than disciplinary sessions, with discussions focusing on managing public perception rather than addressing behavioral problems. Jake had learned to navigate these conversations skillfully, offering carefully worded apologies that acknowledged misunderstandings while avoiding any admission of intentional wrongdoing. His parents had coached him in these techniques, understanding that high school infractions could potentially affect college recruitment if not handled properly. The principal's reluctance to impose meaningful consequences stemmed partly from genuine concern about the school's athletic programs, but also from personal career considerations that made controversy extremely dangerous for his professional future. The school board evaluated his performance primarily through metrics related to college placement rates, championship victories, and community satisfaction levels, all of which could be jeopardized by conflicts with influential families like the Morrisons. Emma had begun to understand these institutional dynamics through conversations with other faculty members who had encountered similar situations during their careers at Riverside High School. Ms. Sarah Kim had been particularly helpful in explaining the unofficial rules that governed interactions between teachers and privileged students, sharing strategies that had allowed her to survive 15 years in an environment where administrative support could not be taken for granted. The art teacher's advice centered on documentation, discretion, and strategic patience, recommending that Emma continue recording incidents while avoiding any actions that might be perceived as escalatory or unprofessional. Sarah had seen too many colleagues sacrifice their careers by pushing too hard against systems designed to protect certain students, and she genuinely believed that Emma's best strategy involved outlasting Jake's interest rather than confronting it directly. Other faculty members offered varying perspectives based on their own experiences and philosophical approaches to the challenges of teaching in environments where student behavior was influenced by factors beyond typical adolescent development. Some advocated for strict adherence to rules regardless of consequences, while others suggested that survival required learning to pick battles carefully and accept that perfect justice was rarely achievable within institutional constraints. Emma appreciated these insights while recognizing that her colleagues' advice was based on experiences that did not account for her unique background and capabilities. Their recommendations assumed that she was as vulnerable as she appeared, lacking any resources beyond what the school system might provide for her protection. They had no way of knowing that her quiet demeanor concealed years of training and disciplines that had taught her to handle physical and psychological pressure with techniques far more sophisticated than anything they might imagine. Her evening sessions at the Dragon's Path studio had become increasingly important as Jake's harassment escalated, providing both physical preparation and mental clarity about the principles that would guide her response to whatever confrontation seemed increasingly inevitable. Master Liu Wei had noticed the tension in her training, leading to conversations about the practical application of martial arts philosophy in situations where conventional wisdom might prove inadequate. These discussions had reinforced Emma's understanding that true martial arts mastery extended far beyond physical techniques to encompass judgment, timing, and proportional response to threats. Master Liu emphasized that the greatest warriors were those who achieved their objectives with minimal force, using only what was necessary to neutralize dangers while maintaining control over both the situation and their own emotional state. Emma had spent considerable time analyzing Jake's behavioral patterns, recognizing the escalation cycle that seemed to drive his interactions with targets. She understood that his campaign against her was following a predictable trajectory that would continue intensifying until either she submitted to his dominance or something occurred to disrupt the pattern entirely. Her training had taught her to recognize the moment when defensive measures might become necessary, while her professional judgment helped her evaluate the potential consequences of various response strategies. The school environment presented unique challenges because any physical confrontation would occur within an institutional setting where her actions would be subject to administrative review and potential legal scrutiny. Emma knew that her response to Jake's harassment would need to be both effective and defensible, demonstrating clear justification for whatever force might become necessary, while avoiding any appearance of excessive or premeditated retaliation. Her documentation of Jake's behavior had been meticulous, creating a paper trail that would support claims of ongoing harassment if the situation eventually required formal intervention. However, Emma had also begun preparing for the possibility that institutional channels might prove inadequate, developing contingency plans that would allow her to protect herself while minimizing potential career consequences. The catalyst event occurred on a Tuesday afternoon during the lunch period when Emma had decided to use the quiet time for reviewing lesson plans in the hallway near the trophy case. She had chosen this location partly because it was usually deserted during the meal period, and partly because she found the natural light from the nearby windows conducive to concentration. The irony that she was surrounded by symbols of athletic achievement when Jake and his friends approached was not lost on her later reflection. Jake's approach had been theatrical rather than stealthy, suggesting that public humiliation was a key component of whatever he had planned for their encounter. Ryan and Connor flanked him in a formation that blocked potential escape routes while creating the impression of casual conversation rather than deliberate intimidation. Their body language suggested confidence bordering on arrogance, as if they were approaching a routine exercise rather than a confrontation with uncertain outcomes. Emma recognized the tactical positioning immediately, her training automatically cataloging potential threats and available responses, while maintaining her outward appearance of calm attention to her paperwork. She understood that Jake's group believed they held every advantage in this situation, from physical size and numbers to institutional protection and social status. Their assumptions about her vulnerability would prove to be both their primary tactical error and the source of their eventual downfall. The conversation began with Jake's trademark combination of false politeness and subtle menace, designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. He positioned himself uncomfortably close to Emma's personal space, using his height advantage to create psychological pressure, while his companions provided visual support for his implied threats. Their strategy relied on intimidation through presence rather than explicit verbal threats, a technique they had refined through years of successful campaigns against previous targets. Emma's response was measured and professional, acknowledging Jake's presence without showing either fear or aggression that might escalate the situation prematurely. Her martial arts training had taught her to conserve energy and maintain situational awareness during confrontations, avoiding emotional reactions that might compromise her judgment or telegraph her capabilities to potential opponents. She understood that Jake was testing her responses, looking for signs of weakness that would encourage further aggression. The escalation occurred when Jake's verbal harassment shifted toward physical boundary violations, beginning with seemingly accidental contact that gradually became more deliberate and invasive. His hands found reasons to touch her shoulders, her arms, and eventually her waist as he leaned closer during their conversation, each contact designed to establish his dominance while gauging her willingness to resist his advances. Ryan and Connor provided encouragement through their laughter and comments, creating a pack mentality that reinforced Jake's belief in his invulnerability. Emma's training had prepared her for exactly this type of progressive assault, where psychological intimidation was combined with physical boundary violations to break down a target's resistance gradually. She recognized that Jake was following a predatory pattern that would continue escalating until either she submitted to his dominance or something occurred to disrupt his sense of control over the situation. The moment of truth arrived when Jake's harassment crossed the line from intimidation into assault, his hands moving toward her clothing with clear intent to humiliate her in the most degrading manner possible. His attempt to lift her skirt was both a culmination of his campaign against her authority and a declaration that no boundary would be respected if it interfered with his entertainment. Ryan and Connor's excited encouragement suggested that this was a planned escalation rather than a spontaneous impulse, indicating that they had discussed and anticipated this moment. Emma's response was instantaneous and devastating. Years of training compressed into a few seconds of perfectly executed technique that transformed Jake from predator to victim faster than his companions could process what was happening. Her movements were economical and precise, using Jake's own momentum and positioning against him while applying just enough force to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury. The sound of his body hitting the floor echoed through the hallway like a thunderclap, followed by stunned silence as everyone present struggled to comprehend the sudden reversal of power dynamics. Jake found himself face down on the linoleum with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that made any movement inadvisable, his earlier confidence replaced by shocked confusion as he realized that his assumptions about Emma's vulnerability had been completely wrong. The pain radiating through his shoulder and wrist provided immediate feedback about the foolishness of continuing his resistance, while his inability to escape despite his size advantage demonstrated that he was dealing with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond anything he had encountered previously. Ryan and Connor's reaction was equally dramatic, their earlier bravado evaporating as they witnessed their seemingly invincible leader reduced to helplessness by someone they had dismissed as an easy target. Their stunned expressions revealed the depth of their miscalculation as they struggled to reconcile Emma's quiet classroom persona with the controlled violence she had just demonstrated. The realization that they might be next if they attempted to intervene kept them frozen against the lockers, uncertain whether flight or submission offered the better chance of avoiding similar treatment. Emma maintained her control over Jake while addressing his companions with the same calm professionalism she used in her chemistry classes, explaining that their friend's current predicament was entirely the result of his own choices and could be resolved quickly if everyone remained calm and cooperative. Her voice carried no anger or excitement, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone managing a situation that required careful attention to details and proportional responses. The hallway remained eerily quiet as other students began to appear, drawn by the commotion but uncertain about what they were witnessing. Emma's demonstration had lasted only seconds, but its impact was reverberating through everyone present as they struggled to process the transformation of power dynamics that had just occurred. The quiet substitute teacher who had seemed so vulnerable was still quiet, but clearly not vulnerable in any way that mattered. Jake's attempts to negotiate his release were met with patient explanations about the natural consequences of his actions, delivered in the same educational tone Emma used when explaining chemical reactions to her students. She made it clear that his current discomfort was entirely proportional to the threat he had posed, and that his situation would improve immediately upon his commitment to discontinue his harassment campaign permanently. The institutional response to this incident would reveal the true nature of power dynamics within Riverside High School, as administrators found themselves forced to choose between supporting their star athlete or acknowledging that their substitute teacher had been justified in defending herself against assault. Emma understood that her actions would be scrutinized carefully, but she also knew that her documentation of Jake's behavior and the public nature of his attempted assault would make it difficult for the administration to portray her as the aggressor. In this situation, Principal Hoffman's arrival at the scene marked the beginning of damage control efforts that would test everyone's commitment to truth versus institutional convenience. His immediate concern was clearly about managing the public relations aspects of the situation rather than determining facts or ensuring justice, as evidenced by his focus on dispersing witnesses and controlling the narrative rather than addressing the underlying issues that had led to the confrontation. Emma's release of Jake was conditional upon his verbal agreement to maintain appropriate behavior toward all faculty members, delivered in front of sufficient witnesses to ensure accountability for any future violations. Her handling of the situation demonstrated that she possessed both the capability and the judgment necessary to defend herself without becoming the aggressor, leaving the administration with limited options for portraying her actions as inappropriate or excessive. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent to which Jake's behavior had been enabled by institutional tolerance and social privilege, as his shock at facing real consequences suggested that this was his first encounter with meaningful accountability for his actions. His humiliation was complete, not just because he had been physically dominated, but because his invulnerability had been exposed as an illusion maintained by others' willingness to enable his misconduct. Ryan and Connor's retreat from the scene, without attempting to help their friend, demonstrated the shallow Nature of relationships built on shared privilege rather than genuine loyalty or respect. Their abandonment of Jake in his moment of vulnerability revealed that their alliance had been based on his perceived strength rather than any deeper connection, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions without the support system he had assumed would always protect him. Emma's calm demeanor throughout the incident and its immediate aftermath sent a clear message to everyone present that she was not someone who could be intimidated or victimized through the tactics that had proven successful against her predecessors. Her professional handling of the situation while demonstrating formidable capabilities created a new dynamic that would require significant adjustments from everyone accustomed to the previous balance of power within the school. The documentation Emma had maintained regarding Jake's previous harassment would prove crucial in defending her actions during the administrative review that was certain to follow. Her meticulous records demonstrated a pattern of escalating behavior that had culminated in physical assault, providing clear justification for her defensive response, while undermining any attempts to portray the incident as mutual combat or excessive force. The transformation in hallway dynamics was immediate and visible, as students who had witnessed the confrontation began spreading word throughout the school about what had happened to Jake Morrison and his crew. The story would undoubtedly grow in the telling, but the core message was clear. The quiet substitute teacher was not someone to be underestimated or mistreated, and the protection that athletic status had previously provided might not extend to situations where real consequences were involved. Emma's return to her classroom that afternoon proceeded with professional normalcy, though she could sense the heightened attention and whispered conversations that followed her through the hallways. Her students' behavior during the remaining classes reflected their awareness that something significant had occurred, though their increased respect and attention suggested that whatever they had heard had enhanced rather than diminished their opinion of their temporary teacher. The end of the school day brought a parade of administrative meetings as Principal Hoffman attempted to manage the situation without creating larger problems for himself or the school district. His conversations with Emma were carefully structured to gather information while avoiding any statements that might be interpreted as either condoning or condemning her actions, reflecting his desire to maintain maximum flexibility as the situation developed. Emma's responses to administrative questioning were as methodical and professional as everything else about her approach to the situation, providing factual accounts while avoiding any inflammatory language that might complicate her position. Her documentation spoke for itself, and her calm demeanor during the interviews suggested that she was confident in both the legality and the appropriateness of her response to Jake's assault. The evening news would eventually pick up the story, though initial reports focused more on the unusual nature of a teacher physically subduing a student rather than on the harassment campaign that had precipitated the confrontation. Emma understood that public perception would be crucial in determining the long-term consequences of the incident, and she prepared accordingly for the media attention that was likely to follow. Her training session that evening at the Dragon's Path studio provided an opportunity to process the day's events with Master Liu Wei, whose perspective on the practical application of martial arts principles in civilian situations had proven invaluable throughout Emma's transition from competitive fighting to teaching. His approval of her measured response and emphasis on proportional force validated her approach while preparing her for the challenges that lay ahead. The ripple effects of the confrontation were already beginning to spread through the school community as parents, teachers, and students struggled to process what had happened and what it might mean for the future. Emma understood that her actions had created a new dynamic that would require careful management to achieve positive outcomes, rather than simply replacing one form of dysfunction with another. Jake Morrison's world had fundamentally changed in the space of a few seconds, and his response to that change would determine whether the incident marked the beginning of personal growth or simply the start of a more sophisticated revenge campaign. Emma remained prepared for either possibility while hoping that the shock of facing real consequences might provide the catalyst for genuine behavioral change. The institutional response to the confrontation would reveal whether Riverside High School was capable of learning from this incident, or would simply find new ways to maintain the dysfunctional status quo that had enabled Jake's behavior in the 5-year in the Viva. First place. Emma's documentation and professional handling of the situation had created an opportunity for positive change, but realizing that potential would require courage and commitment from administrators who had previously chosen the path of least resistance when faced with similar challenges. The security footage from the hallway cameras told a story that even Principal Hoffman couldn't spin into something favorable for Jake Morrison. Emma Chun sat in the cramped administrative office, watching herself on the grainy monitor as Jake approached her near the trophy case, his body language unmistakably predatory, even in the low-resolution recording. The audio quality was poor, but the visual evidence was devastating. Jake's hands moving toward her skirt, her lightning-fast response, and his subsequent position on the floor created a narrative that no amount of creative interpretation could transform into mutual combat or teacher misconduct. What Emma discovered while reviewing this footage would change everything she thought she knew about Riverside High School. As she sat beside Assistant Principal Jennifer Walsh, fast-forwarding through weeks of archived recordings at her request, patterns began to emerge that painted a disturbing picture of institutional complicity in student misconduct. The same hallway where Jake had assaulted her had been the scene of multiple incidents involving the same group of boys, all carefully edited out of official incident reports or explained away as harmless teenage behavior. Emma watched in growing horror as the monitor displayed scene after scene of Jake, Ryan, and Connor targeting various faculty members and students. A substitute English teacher cornered near the water fountain, surrounded by the trio while they invaded her personal space and made comments that clearly distressed her. A young male teacher backing away from Jake's aggressive posturing during what should have been a routine hallway conversation. Female students pressed against lockers while the boys loomed over them, their body language suggesting conversations that were anything but consensual. The most disturbing discovery came when Emma noticed the timestamps on the recordings. These incidents weren't random outbursts of teenage misbehavior, but part of a systematic campaign of intimidation that had been ongoing for months. The frequency increased after each administrative meeting, where Jake received what were supposed to be disciplinary conversations, suggesting that these sessions were actually encouraging rather than deterring his behavior. Jennifer Walsh's discomfort was obvious as they reviewed the footage together. Her initial enthusiasm for showing Emma the recording of her own incident had transformed into nervous fidgeting as the scope of documented misconduct became apparent. Her attempts to fast-forward past certain scenes were telling, indicating that she was well aware of what the cameras had captured, but had never expected anyone to review the material systematically. Emma's training in pattern recognition, honed through years of analyzing opponents' fighting styles, allowed her to identify connections that might have escaped casual observation. Jake's group operated with military precision, using coordinated positioning and timing that suggested their tactics had been refined through repeated practice. Their victim selection followed clear criteria, targeting individuals who appeared vulnerable and lacked institutional support, while carefully avoiding confrontations with faculty members who possessed sufficient seniority or political connections to create problems. The revelation that shocked Emma most was discovering that her predecessor, the chemistry teacher who had left mid-semester for personal reasons, had also been targeted by Jake's campaign. The footage showed Mrs. Patterson enduring weeks of escalating harassment that followed the same pattern Emma had experienced, culminating in an incident near the same trophy case where Jake and his friends had cornered the older woman in a confrontation that left her visibly shaken. Emma's request to see Mrs. Patterson's personnel file was initially denied, but her threat to involve law enforcement in reviewing the security footage prompted a grudging cooperation from the administrative staff. What she found in those documents revealed a dedicated teacher with 23 years of experience and consistently excellent evaluations, whose sudden resignation had been preceded by multiple requests for administrative intervention regarding student harassment. The pattern was clear and damning. Mrs. Patterson had followed proper channels, documenting incidents and requesting support, only to receive the same ineffective responses that Emma had encountered. Her eventual resignation had been processed quickly and quietly, with exit interview notes that mentioned inability to adapt to changing student demographics, rather than acknowledging the systematic harassment that had driven her away. Emma's investigation revealed that Mrs. Patterson was not an isolated case. The school's substitute teacher turnover rate was astronomical, with most temporary faculty lasting less than a month before requesting transfers or simply disappearing from the roster. The few who stayed longer were those who taught subjects that Jake's group considered beneath their attention, or who possessed personal characteristics that made them unsuitable targets for the boys' particular brand of harassment. The administrative response to this pattern was equally revealing. Incident reports were routinely filed in ways that obscured connections between events, making it appear that isolated problems were being addressed rather than acknowledging the systematic nature of the harassment. Parents who complained about their children being targeted were given vague assurances and promises of investigation that resulted in no meaningful action. Emma's martial arts background had taught her to think strategically about long-term campaigns rather than focusing solely on individual battles. As she pieced together the evidence of Jake's systematic targeting of faculty members, she began to understand that her confrontation with him was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that required a comprehensive response. Discovery that Jake's behavior had been escalating over time suggested that her physical defeat of him would not resolve the underlying problem, but might actually make it worse. Students who had built their identity around intimidating others often responded to humiliation with increased aggression, seeking opportunities to restore their damaged reputation through even more dramatic displays of dominance. Emma's evening research at home revealed additional disturbing information about the Morrison family's influence within the school district. David Morrison's construction company had not only built the athletic facilities, but held contracts for ongoing maintenance and renovation projects that created financial incentives for administrators to maintain positive relationships with the family. The potential for conflict of interest was obvious, though carefully obscured through layers of corporate structure and political maneuvering. Linda Morrison's role as PTA president provided another avenue for family influence, allowing her to shape parent perceptions and coordinate responses to any situations that might threaten her son's reputation or opportunities. Her social media presence revealed a carefully curated image of family success and community involvement that would make any accusations against Jake appear to be attacks on pillars of local society. The school board members who maintained golf relationships with David Morrison were not simply social connections, but potential allies in any conflict that might threaten the family's interests. Emma understood that challenging Jake's behavior effectively would require confronting an entire network of relationships and financial dependencies that extended far beyond the school building itself. Her investigation into the school's disciplinary policies revealed systematic loopholes that had been crafted to provide maximum flexibility in handling incidents involving star athletes. Vague language about considering all factors and individual circumstances created opportunities for administrators to justify almost any decision, while the emphasis on restorative justice and learning opportunities provided cover for avoiding meaningful consequences. Emma's documentation of these policies and their selective application created a paper trail that would prove valuable if the situation escalated beyond the school level. Her methodical approach to evidence gathering was paying dividends as she built a comprehensive, picture of institutional dysfunction that extended far beyond individual misconduct. The psychological profile of Jake Morrison that emerged from Emma's analysis was both predictable and concerning. His behavior showed classic signs of antisocial personality development, with lack of empathy, disregard for others' rights, and manipulation of social systems for personal advantage. The institutional enabling of his behavior had prevented him from experiencing the natural consequences that might have encouraged behavioral modification during his formative years. Emma's understanding of adolescent psychology, gained through her teaching training, helped her recognize that Jake's current behavior patterns were becoming entrenched personality traits rather than temporary lapses in judgment. Without significant intervention, he was likely to carry these attitudes and behaviors into adult relationships and professional settings, where the consequences would be far more serious than high school disciplinary actions. The realization that she was potentially the first person to successfully resist Jake's intimidation campaign created both opportunity and responsibility for Emma. Her success in defending herself had demonstrated that his perceived invulnerability was an illusion, but it had also marked her as a primary target for retaliation if he chose to escalate rather than retreat from the conflict. Emma's martial arts training had prepared her for the possibility of renewed attacks, but her professional responsibilities required her to consider the safety of other potential victims if Jake redirected his anger toward more vulnerable targets. The security footage had shown him targeting students as well as faculty, suggesting that any escalation might involve individuals who lacked the resources to defend themselves effectively. The evening phone calls began 3 days after the hallway incident, always from blocked numbers and featuring either heavy breathing or whispered threats that were clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. Emma's caller identification system documented the frequency and timing of these calls, creating evidence of harassment that extended beyond the school environment into her private life. The first threatening message was relatively mild, suggesting that she should consider finding employment elsewhere if she wanted to avoid further problems. Subsequent calls escalated in their language and implied threats, with references to her home address and daily routines that indicated surveillance or information gathering beyond what would be available through normal school channels. Emma's decision to involve law enforcement in documenting these threats was strategic rather than reactive. Her experience with competitive martial arts had taught her the importance of establishing official records when conflicts moved beyond sporting venues into personal vendettas. The police reports would provide independent verification of harassment if the situation eventually required legal intervention. Detective Maria Santos of the Millbrook Police Department was initially skeptical about the connection between high school disciplinary issues and criminal harassment, but her attitude changed after reviewing Emma's documentation and the security footage from the school. Her experience with domestic violence cases had familiarized her with patterns of escalating intimidation, and she recognized similarities in the tactics being employed against Emma. The detective's investigation revealed that Jake Morrison had no official criminal record, but several informal complaints had been filed and withdrawn over the years. Parents who had initially sought police intervention in incidents involving their children had subsequently changed their minds after conversations with school administrators or other community members, suggesting that pressure was being applied to discourage official action. Emma's cooperation with Detective Santos created an official paper trail that would be difficult for the Morrison family to suppress or manipulate. The police reports established a pattern of harassment that extended beyond the school's jurisdiction, transforming what might have been dismissed as a student discipline issue into a potential criminal matter requiring professional investigation. The school district's legal counsel became involved when Principal Hoffman realized that the situation was attracting attention from law enforcement agencies. Attorney Michael Chun, no relation to Emma despite the shared surname, specialized in education law and understood the potential liability issues created by institutional tolerance of student harassment targeting faculty members. His review of Emma's documentation and the security footage revealed multiple violations of federal and state regulations regarding workplace safety and harassment prevention. The district's failure to address Jake's pattern of behavior could result in significant financial penalties and legal exposure if the situation resulted in formal complaints or lawsuits. The legal implications extended beyond Emma's individual case to encompass potential claims from other victims who might come forward once they learned that official action was being taken. The substitute teachers who had left abruptly, the students who had been targeted, and the regular faculty members who had endured harassment all represented potential plaintiffs in actions that could prove extremely costly for the district. Attorney Chen's recommendations focused on damage control and liability mitigation rather than justice or behavioral correction. His primary concern was protecting the district from legal consequences rather than addressing the underlying problems that had created the situation. This approach would prove problematic as Emma's investigation continued to reveal the scope of institutional dysfunction. The first anonymous tip arrived in Emma's school mailbox on a Thursday morning, typed on plain paper and containing specific information about financial irregularities in the athletic department budget. The document alleged that Morrison Construction had been receiving inflated payments for maintenance and renovation work, with portions of those overcharges being funneled back to support Jake's recruitment activities and other expenses not typically covered by school budgets. Emma's initial instinct was to dismiss the anonymous allegation as potentially fabricated or exaggerated, but her systematic approach to evidence evaluation prompted her to investigate the claims rather than ignoring them. Her background in chemistry had taught her to test hypotheses through careful observation and documentation rather than accepting or rejecting information based on assumptions. The school district's budget documents were public records, available through Freedom of Information requests that Emma submitted through proper channels. Her analysis of these financial reports revealed patterns of spending that supported some of the anonymous tipster's allegations, particularly regarding maintenance contracts and athletic facility improvements that seemed disproportionately expensive compared to similar projects in neighboring districts. The comparison data Emma compiled showed that Riverside High School's maintenance costs per square foot were nearly double the regional average, with Morrison Construction receiving the majority of these contracts through bidding processes that appeared to discourage meaningful competition. The timing of these expenditures correlated suspiciously with periods when Jake's disciplinary issues might have created problems for the family's relationship with school administrators. Emma's investigation revealed that the Athletic Booster Club, heavily influenced by the Morrison family's donations, had been funding activities that should have been covered by regular school budgets. This arrangement created opportunities for financial manipulation, while obscuring the true costs of maintaining the programs that supported Jake's athletic career and college recruitment prospects. The anonymous tipster's second communication provided more specific information about recruiting violations and improper benefits that Jake had allegedly received through arrangements coordinated between his father's business connections and college athletic programs. These allegations, if true, could jeopardize not only Jake's eligibility but the school's relationship with collegiate athletic associations. Emma's decision to share this information with Detective Santos reflected her understanding that the situation had evolved beyond simple harassment into potential financial crimes that required professional investigation. Her documentation and analysis had created a foundation for official action that could not be dismissed or suppressed through the informal pressure tactics that had proven effective in previous situations. The detective's referral of the financial allegations to the district attorney's office marked a significant escalation in the stakes surrounding Emma's confrontation with Jake Morrison. What had begun as a teacher defending herself against student Assault was transforming into a comprehensive investigation of corruption and institutional misconduct that could result in criminal charges and federal oversight. Emma's role was shifting from victim to whistleblower as her systematic documentation of problems at Riverside High School attracted attention from law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies. Her martial arts training had prepared her for physical confrontation, but her teaching background and analytical skills were proving equally valuable in exposing the systematic dysfunction that had enabled Jake's behavior. The pressure on Emma was intensifying as various interests realized that her investigation threatened not just individual reputations, but an entire network of relationships and financial arrangements that had operated in the shadows for years. Her quiet competence and methodical approach to evidence gathering had created a threat that could not be neutralized through traditional intimidation tactics. The threatening phone calls were joined by more sophisticated forms of harassment, including surveillance of her home and workplace, that suggested professional involvement rather than amateur intimidation. Emma's awareness of these activities prompted her to upgrade her personal security measures while continuing to document everything through official channels. Her evening training sessions with Master Lu Wei took on new significance as the situation escalated beyond simple bullying into potentially dangerous retaliation by individuals with significant resources and motivation to silence her investigation. The philosophical discussions about proportional response and strategic thinking that had always been part of her martial arts education became practical considerations for managing a complex and evolving threat environment. Emma's transformation from quiet substitute teacher to central figure in a comprehensive investigation of institutional corruption reflected both her personal courage and the systematic nature of the problems she had uncovered. Her initial goal of simply teaching chemistry and avoiding conflict had evolved into a mission to expose and correct dysfunction that affected not just her own safety, but the educational environment for hundreds of students and dozens of faculty members. The realization that her confrontation with Jake Morrison had been just the beginning rather than the resolution of her challenges at Riverside High School required Emma to draw upon all of her training and experience to navigate increasingly dangerous waters. Her success would depend not just on her ability to defend herself physically, but on her skill in building alliances and using institutional processes to achieve justice in an environment where powerful interests were aligned against transparency and accountability. The stakes were rising with each piece of evidence Emma uncovered, transforming a personal conflict into a community-wide confrontation between entrenched corruption and the possibility of meaningful reform. Her quiet determination and systematic approach to problem-solving were about to be tested in ways that would determine not just her own future, but the direction of institutional change at Riverside High School and potentially throughout the entire district. The emergency school board meeting was called for a Thursday evening in November, the kind of cold autumn night when most community members would have preferred to stay home rather than venture out for what many assumed would be routine administrative business. The Millbrook Community Center had been chosen as the venue instead of the usual district office conference room, a decision that reflected both the anticipated crowd size and the administration's desire to demonstrate transparency in handling what had become a very public controversy. Emma Chun arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained months of meticulously organized evidence, documenting not just her own harassment, but a systematic pattern of misconduct that extended throughout Riverside High School's power structure. Her quiet confidence as she entered the community center contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from school district officials who were clearly struggling to maintain control over a situation that had grown far beyond their initial expectations. Detective Maria Santos was already present, positioned near the back of the room where she could observe the proceedings while remaining available if her professional expertise became necessary. Her presence served multiple purposes, providing both security for Emma and visible evidence that law enforcement was taking the allegations seriously. The detective's casual conversation with representatives from the state education department made it clear that the evening's discussions would have implications extending far beyond local politics. The Morrison family occupied the front row, with the territorial confidence of people accustomed to commanding respect through presence alone. David Morrison's tailored suit and perfectly groomed appearance projected the image of a successful businessman whose integrity was beyond question, while Linda Morrison's designer outfit and carefully styled hair reinforced their status as pillars of the community. Jake sat between his parents, his leather jacket replaced by a conservative, button-down shirt that was clearly intended to present a more mature and responsible image than his usual swagger suggested. Principal Derek Hoffman's opening remarks attempted to frame the meeting as a routine review of policies and procedures rather than an investigation into specific allegations of misconduct and corruption. His carefully worded statement about the district's commitment to maintaining high standards while supporting all students and faculty members was the kind of political doublespeak that said nothing while appearing to address everything. School Board President Margaret Walsh called for Emma to present her concerns, an invitation that had been negotiated through weeks of legal maneuvering between the district's attorneys and the growing coalition of parents, teachers, and community members who had rallied to support her cause. Emma's presentation would be the first time that many board members heard a comprehensive account of the evidence she had compiled, despite months of attempts to bring these issues to their attention through normal channels. Emma's voice was steady and professional as she began her presentation, displaying the same calm competence that had characterized her teaching throughout the crisis. Her first exhibit was a timeline showing the progression of Jake Morrison's harassment campaign against her, supported by documentation that included incident reports, witness statements, and timestamps from security footage that left no room for interpretation about the escalating nature of his behavior. The reaction in the room was immediate and visceral as Emma played audio recordings of the threatening phone call she had received, the whispered menaces and heavy breathing that had invaded her private life in the weeks following her physical confrontation with Jake. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly hearing this evidence for the first time, despite assurances from district administrators that the situation was being handled appropriately. Emma's second phase of evidence focused on the pattern of targeting that affected multiple victims throughout the school, using security footage and witness testimony to demonstrate that her experience was not isolated, but part of a systematic campaign of intimidation. The faces of other teachers appeared on the projection screen, their obvious distress during encounters with Jake's group, creating a visual narrative that was impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. The testimony from Mrs. Patterson, the chemistry teacher who had resigned mid-semester, was delivered via video conference from her new position in a neighboring state. Her emotional account of the harassment that had driven her from a career she loved provided context for Emma's situation while demonstrating the long-term consequences of institutional indifference to student misconduct. Her 23 years of exemplary service made her allegations particularly credible and damaging to the district's claims of proper oversight. Emma's presentation of financial evidence marked the moment when the meeting transformed from a personnel matter into a potential criminal investigation. Her analysis of construction contracts, maintenance expenditures, and athletic department funding revealed a web of financial relationships that created obvious conflicts of interest and opportunities for corruption. The comparison data from other school districts made the irregularities at Riverside High School impossible to explain through normal variations in costs or needs. David Morrison's attempt to interrupt Emma's presentation was firmly rebuffed by Board President Walsh, who had clearly prepared for such tactics through consultation with the district's legal counsel. Morrison's obvious agitation as Emma detailed the financial anomalies connected to his company's contracts with the school district provided compelling evidence that her allegiation had struck close to targets he preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The anonymous tips that had guided Emma's investigation were revealed to have come from multiple sources within the school district, including faculty members, administrative staff, and even some school board members who had grown uncomfortable with the Morrison family's influence over policy decisions. Their willingness to come forward publicly, despite obvious risks to their careers and relationships, demonstrated the depth of concern about institutional dysfunction at Riverside High School. Emma's documentation of recruiting violations and improper benefits provided to Jake Morrison created the most serious legal exposure for both the family and the school district. Her evidence included financial records, witness statements, and communications that showed clear violations of both state athletic association rules and federal regulations governing educational institutions. The potential penalties for these violations extended beyond simple fines to include loss of accreditation and federal funding that could devastate the district's financial stability. The testimony from students who had been victimized by Jake's harassment campaign was perhaps the most emotionally powerful element of Emma's presentation. Jessica Miller, the junior who had witnessed Emma's original confrontation with Jake, spoke eloquently about the climate of fear that his behavior had created throughout the school. Her description of students altering their schedules and avoiding certain areas of the building to minimize contact with Jake's group painted a disturbing picture of educational disruption caused by institutional tolerance of bullying. Tyler Morrison's decision to testify against his older brother represented a dramatic fracture within the Morrison family that nobody in the room had anticipated. The younger Morrison's account of Jake's bragging about his immunity from consequences and his family's ability to manipulate school officials provided insider confirmation of the arrogance and entitlement that had driven the harassment campaign. His obvious courage in speaking truth, despite family pressure, earned him respect from audience members who had initially assumed he would support his brother. The revelation that Jake had recorded some of his harassment activities on his cell phone, treating them as entertainment to share with friends, provided irrefutable evidence of his intentions and state of mind during the incidents. The audio and video files recovered from his device during the police investigation showed not just the actions themselves, but his obvious pleasure in causing distress to his victims. Principal Hoffman's attempts to defend his handling of the situation crumbled under questioning from board members, who were clearly learning details about the harassment campaign for the first time. His claims of being unaware of the systematic nature of Jake's behavior were contradicted by Emma's documentation of the reports she had filed and the meetings she had requested. His obvious discomfort as board members reviewed his responses to previous complaints suggested that his priority had been protecting the school's athletic programs rather than ensuring student and faculty safety. The financial audit report commissioned by the State Education Department confirmed Emma's analysis of irregularities in construction contracts and athletic department expenditures. The independent auditor's findings revealed not just overbilling and kickback schemes, but systematic manipulation of bidding processes designed to ensure that Morrison Construction received preferential treatment, despite higher costs and questionable quality standards. David Morrison's resignation from all volunteer positions with the school district was announced during the meeting, a preemptive move clearly designed to minimize legal exposure and demonstrate contrition. His statement accepting responsibility for poor judgment and inadequate oversight of business relationships was carefully crafted to avoid admissions that might be used against him in criminal proceedings, but his obvious defeat was apparent to everyone present. The school board's unanimous vote to terminate Principal Hoffman's contract represented a clear acknowledgement that institutional leadership had failed in its fundamental responsibility to protect students and faculty from harassment and abuse. His replacement by an interim principal with specific expertise in institutional reform and crisis management signaled the board's commitment to comprehensive changes rather than cosmetic adjustments. Jake Morrison's expulsion from Riverside High School was accompanied by referrals to both the State Athletic Association and the colleges that had been recruiting him, effectively ending his football career and forcing him to confront consequences that his family's influence could not mitigate. His obvious shock at facing real accountability for his actions suggested that this was his first experience with a system that would not bend to accommodate his behavior. The criminal charges filed against Jake for harassment and assault, combined with the federal investigation into financial irregularities at the school district, transformed the Morrison family from local power brokers into defendants in multiple legal proceedings. Their rapid fall from influence demonstrated how quickly perceived invulnerability could evaporate when institutional protection was removed and evidence of wrongdoing became public. Emma's decision to continue teaching at Riverside High School, rather than accepting offers from other districts, reflected her commitment to seeing the reform process through to completion. Her transformation from quiet substitute teacher to catalyst for institutional change had revealed leadership qualities that made her an obvious choice for permanent appointment to the chemistry department, along with additional responsibilities for developing new harassment prevention and reporting procedures. The implementation of comprehensive reforms at Riverside High School began immediately after the board meeting, with new policies designed to prevent the concentration of power and influence that had enabled the Morrison family's misconduct. Independent oversight mechanisms, mandatory reporting procedures, and regular auditing of athletic department finances created accountability structures that would make future abuse much more difficult to sustain. The wrestling coach Maria Gonzalez became Emma's closest ally in implementing cultural changes that went beyond policy, modifications to address the underlying attitudes and behaviors that had allowed harassment to flourish. Their collaboration in developing peer intervention programs and bystander education curricula provided students with tools and knowledge necessary to recognize and resist bullying behaviors before they escalated into assault. Master Liu Wei's involvement in developing conflict resolution and de-escalation training for faculty and staff brought Emma's martial arts philosophy into the educational environment in ways that emphasized discipline, respect, and proportional response to threats. The integration of these principles into the school's approach to behavioral management created a framework for handling disputes that prioritized education and growth over punishment and exclusion. The community support that emerged during Emma's campaign for institutional reform demonstrated that many Millbrook residents had grown tired of the Morrison family's dominance over local affairs and were ready for leadership that prioritized integrity over connections. The grassroots organization that formed around Emma's cause evolved into a permanent civic engagement group focused on maintaining transparency and accountability in all local institutions. Emma's testimony before the state legislature about her experiences at Riverside High School contributed to the passage of comprehensive education reform legislation that strengthened protections for both students and faculty while creating more effective oversight mechanisms for school district operations. Her expertise in both education and institutional analysis made her a valuable resource for policymakers seeking practical solutions to systemic problems. The scholarship fund established in Mrs. Patterson's name provided financial support for teachers pursuing advanced training in harassment prevention and institutional reform, ensuring that the lessons learned at Riverside High School would benefit educators throughout the region. Emma's leadership in developing the program's curriculum and selection criteria reflected her commitment to sharing knowledge and preventing similar situations from developing elsewhere. Jake Morrison's enrollment in a military-style boarding school represented his parents' last attempt to impose structure and discipline that might redirect his development in more positive directions. His removal from the social environment that had enabled his misconduct created opportunities for personal growth. though the success of this intervention would depend largely on his willingness to accept responsibility for his actions and commit to genuine behavioral change. The civil lawsuits filed by other victims of Jake's harassment campaign, supported by the evidence Emma had compiled, resulted in substantial financial settlements that provided both compensation for damages and funding for ongoing prevention programs. The monetary consequences of tolerating harassment created powerful incentives for other school districts to address similar problems proactively rather than waiting for crisis situations to develop. Emma's recognition as State Teacher of the Year reflected not just her excellence in classroom instruction, but her courage in confronting institutional dysfunction and her leadership in developing solutions that protected vulnerable individuals while promoting positive change. Her acceptance speech emphasized the importance of standing up for principles, even when doing so involved personal risk and professional uncertainty. The documentary film about Emma's experiences at Riverside High School brought national attention to issues of harassment, institutional corruption, and the importance of bystander intervention in educational settings. Her cooperation with the filmmakers reflected her commitment to education and advocacy that extended far beyond her own situation to address systemic problems affecting schools throughout the country. The martial arts studio that Emma established, in partnership with Master Lu Wei, provided both physical training and character development for young people seeking alternatives to the toxic masculinity and entitlement that had characterized Jake Morrison's social circle. The integration of academic tutoring with martial arts instruction created a comprehensive program that addressed both intellectual and physical development while emphasizing respect, discipline, and community service. Emma's marriage to Detective Santos, announced at the 5-year anniversary of the original school board meeting, represented not just a personal celebration, but a symbolic union of law enforcement and education in the ongoing effort to create safer and more equitable institutions. Their joint work on community safety initiatives demonstrated how professional relationships forged during crisis situations could evolve into personal connections that strengthened both individuals and the causes they served. The transformation of Riverside High School from an institution dominated by privilege and intimidation into a model of inclusive excellence and ethical leadership represented the kind of comprehensive reform that Emma had envisioned when she first decided to fight back against Jake Morrison's harassment. Her quiet determination and systematic approach to problem solving had created changes that extended far beyond her original goal of simply being able to teach chemistry without facing assault and intimidation. The annual Emma Chun Award for Courage in Education, established by the State Teachers Association, recognized educators who demonstrated exceptional bravery in confronting institutional problems and advocating for student and faculty safety. The award criteria emphasized not just individual courage, but the systematic approach to evidence gathering and alliance building that had made Emma's campaign successful. Jake Morrison's eventual career as a substance abuse counselor, following his completion of college and professional training programs, represented the kind of redemption that Emma had hoped might emerge from the consequences he faced for his high school behavior. His work with young people struggling with issues of entitlement and aggression drew directly on his own experiences with accountability and behavioral change. The legacy of Emma's confrontation with institutional dysfunction at Riverside High School extended far beyond the specific reforms implemented at that school to influence policy and practice throughout the educational system. Her demonstration that quiet competence and systematic preparation could triumph over entrenched corruption and intimidation provided a template for other educators facing similar challenges in their own professional environments. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning of Jake Morrison's sentencing hearing, with overflow crowds gathered in the hallway and lobby of the Millbrook County Courthouse. Emma Chun sat in the front row with Detective Santos beside her, Watching as the young man who had once seemed invincible shuffled to the defendant's table in shackles and an orange jumpsuit that made him appear far younger and more vulnerable than the swaggering athlete who had terrorized Riverside High School just 18 months earlier. Judge Patricia Williams had presided over hundreds of cases involving young offenders, but the comprehensive nature of Jake's crimes and the key systematic institutional failures that had enabled them made this proceeding particularly significant. For the community, the charges ranged from sexual assault and criminal harassment to conspiracy and financial fraud schemes, creating a legal complexity that reflected the depth of corruption that Emma's investigation had uncovered throughout the school district. The victim impact statements began with Mrs. Patterson, now teaching at a prestigious private academy in Vermont, where her expertise was appreciated and her safety was guaranteed. Her video testimony described not just the immediate trauma of Jake's harassment, but the long-term professional and personal consequences of being driven from a career she had devoted her life to building. Her voice remained steady as she explained how the institutional betrayal had been more devastating than the individual acts of misconduct, creating trust issues that continued to affect her interactions with students and colleagues. Jessica Miller had transformed from a frightened junior who witnessed Emma's original confrontation with Jake into a confident college freshman studying criminal justice with plans to specialize in victim advocacy. Her statement to the court described how Emma's courage in fighting back had inspired her own journey toward finding her voice and standing up for others who might lack the resources or knowledge necessary to defend themselves effectively. Emma's own victim impact statement was characteristically measured and professional, focusing less on personal grievances than on the broader implications of allowing harassment and corruption to flourish unchecked in educational environments. She spoke about the responsibility that institutions have to protect vulnerable individuals and the importance of creating systems that encourage reporting and accountability rather than silence and complicity. The financial impact assessment presented by the state auditor revealed that the Morrison family schemes had cost the school district nearly $2 million over a 5-year period, money that should have been invested in educational programs, teacher salaries, and facility improvements that would have benefited all students, rather than advancing the interests of a single family. The systematic nature of the overbilling and kickback arrangements demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested legal expertise and careful planning rather than opportunistic misconduct. Jake's defense attorney attempted to portray his client as a victim of parental manipulation and institutional enabling, arguing that an 18-year-old could not be held fully responsible for participating in schemes designed and implemented by adults with far more experience and authority. The argument had some legal merit, but the evidence of Jake's personal enjoyment in causing suffering to others, documented through his own recordings and social media posts, undermined claims that he was simply following orders or instructions. David Morrison's plea agreement had already resulted in his conviction on federal fraud charges and a 3-year prison sentence, along with restitution payments that would continue for decades as he attempted to repay the money stolen from public coffers. His construction company had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to provide partial compensation to the school district and other victims of the family's financial schemes. Linda Morrison's cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a reduced sentence of probation and community service, though her role as PTA president and community leader had been permanently destroyed by revelations about her knowledge of and participation in her family's misconduct. Her testimony against her husband and son demonstrated the complete breakdown of family loyalty that often accompanies criminal prosecutions involving financial crimes and conspiracy charges. The institutional reforms at Riverside High School had progressed far beyond the initial policy changes implemented immediately after Emma's revelations became public. The new principal, Dr. Sarah Kim, had been promoted from her position as art teacher, based on her integrity and her early support for Emma's efforts to expose the systematic problems within the school. Her leadership style emphasized her transparency, accountability, and shared decision-making that prevented the concentration of power that had enabled the Morrison family's influence. The student culture at Riverside High School had undergone a dramatic transformation as well, with peer intervention programs and bystander education creating an environment where harassment and intimidation were actively discouraged by students themselves rather than ignored or tacitly supported. The wrestling team, under Coach Gonzalez's leadership, had become a model program that emphasized character development and community service alongside athletic achievement. Emma's permanent appointment as head of the science department had provided her with the institutional platform necessary to implement comprehensive reforms in curriculum and teaching methods that emphasized critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and social responsibility. Her integration of martial arts philosophy into her teaching approach had proven remarkably effective in helping students develop self-discipline and respect for others while maintaining high academic standards. The Dragon's Path Martial Arts Studio had expanded significantly under Emma and Master Liu Wei's joint leadership, with programs specifically designed for educators, law enforcement officers, and other professionals who might face physical or psychological threats in their work environments. The integration of self-defense techniques with conflict resolution and de-escalation training had created a comprehensive approach to personal safety that emphasized prevention and proportional response. Emma's testimony before congressional committees investigating corruption in educational institutions had contributed to the passage of federal legislation requiring enhanced oversight and transparency in school district financial operations. Her expertise in both education and institutional analysis had made her a sought-after consultant for districts facing similar challenges with powerful families or community interests that threatened institutional integrity. The scholarship program established in honor of the teachers who had been victimized by Jake's harassment campaign had grown into a national foundation supporting educators who demonstrated courage in confronting institutional dysfunction. Emma's leadership in developing selection criteria and program structure had ensured that recipients possess both the skills and the commitment necessary to create positive change in their own professional environments. Jake's sentencing to 5 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 3 years reflected Judge Williams' assessment that meaningful consequences were necessary both for his personal development and as a deterrent to others who might consider similar behavior. The sentence also included mandatory counseling for anger management and sexual misconduct, along with community service requirements that would continue throughout his parole period. The civil lawsuits filed by other victims of the Morrison family's systematic misconduct had resulted in settlements totaling over $8 million, money that was used to establish permanent prevention programs and victim support services throughout the region. The financial consequences of tolerating harassment and corruption had created powerful incentives for other institutions to address similar problems proactively rather than waiting for crisis situations to develop. Emma's recognition with the Presidential Medal for Excellence in Education reflected not just her classroom achievements but her extraordinary courage in confronting institutional corruption and her leadership in developing solutions that protected vulnerable individuals while promoting systemic reform. Her acceptance speech at the White House emphasized the importance of ordinary individuals taking extraordinary action when faced with injustice and institutional failure. The documentary film about Emma's experiences had been nominated for an Academy Award and had sparked national conversations about harassment in educational settings, the corrupting influence of money in public institutions, and the importance of bystander intervention in preventing abuse. Emma's decision to donate her proceeds from the film to support victim advocacy programs demonstrated her continued commitment to causes larger than her own recognition or financial benefit. the Regional Conference on Institutional Integrity, that Emma organized annually, had become a premier professional development opportunity for educators, administrators, and community leaders seeking practical strategies for preventing and addressing corruption, harassment, and abuse of power. The conference's emphasis on evidence-based approaches and systematic reform had influenced policy and practice throughout the educational system. Emma's marriage to Detective Santos had been celebrated not just as a personal milestone, but as a symbol of the collaborative relationships between education and law enforcement that were necessary to create truly safe learning environments. Their joint work on community safety initiatives had demonstrated how professional partnerships forged during crisis situations could evolve into personal connections that strengthened both individuals and the institutions they served. The establishment of the Chun Center for Educational Ethics at the State University provided a permanent institutional home for research and training related to preventing corruption and harassment in educational settings. Emma's role as founding director allowed her to influence teacher preparation programs and administrator training in ways that would create lasting improvements in institutional culture and accountability mechanisms. Jake Morrison's transformation during his incarceration had been remarkable to observe, with his participation in victim impact programs and substance abuse counseling creating genuine insights into the consequences of his previous behavior. His letters of apology to Emma and other victims, while not excusing his actions, demonstrated a level of self-reflection and acceptance of responsibility that had been completely absent during his high school years. The victim advocacy program that Jake eventually established after his release from prison drew directly on his own experiences with accountability and behavioral change, providing support and counseling for young people struggling with issues of entitlement, aggression, and abuse of power. His unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the justice system made him an effective counselor for individuals facing similar challenges. Emma's second book, focusing on practical strategies for institutional reform and systematic approaches to preventing harassment, had become required reading in graduate programs for educational administration and public policy. Her combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience provided insights that were valuable for both academics and practitioners working to create more ethical and accountable institutions. The annual Emma Chun Award for Courage in Education had evolved into one of the most prestigious recognitions in the profession, with recipients selected not just for individual bravery, but for their systematic approach to evidence gathering, alliance building, and sustainable reform. The award criteria emphasized the importance of documentation, strategic thinking, and collaborative leadership in creating lasting institutional change. The 10-year anniversary commemoration of Emma's original confrontation with Jake Morrison brought together hundreds of educators, community leaders, and advocates from throughout the region to celebrate the progress that had been made while acknowledging the ongoing challenges that remained in creating truly safe and equitable educational environments. Emma's keynote address emphasized that lasting change required sustained commitment and vigilance rather than assuming that initial victories guaranteed permanent progress. The research study conducted by the State University's Education Department had documented measurable improvements in school climate, academic achievement, and community satisfaction at Riverside High School and other institutions that had implemented similar reforms. The data provided empirical evidence that investing in prevention and accountability produced better outcomes for all stakeholders than tolerating dysfunction and responding only after crises developed. Emma's appointment to the State Board of Education provided her with a platform for influencing policy at the highest levels, while maintaining her connection to classroom teaching and daily educational practice. Her unique combination of frontline experience and systematic analysis made her an effective advocate for reforms that were both practical and transformative. The mentorship program that paired experienced teachers who had successfully confronted institutional challenges with newer educators facing similar situations, had become a model for professional development that emphasized courage, integrity, and strategic thinking. Emma's role in developing the program's curriculum and training protocols ensured that participants received both emotional support and practical tools for navigating complex ethical and professional challenges. The Legacy Scholarship Fund, established in honor of Mrs. Patterson and other teachers who had been victimized by systematic harassment, had grown into a substantial endowment, supporting educational innovation and institutional reform initiatives. Emma's leadership in managing the fund's investments and grant-making had ensured that resources were directed toward programs with proven track records of creating positive change. The Community Organizing Training Institute that Emma founded had become a regional resource for individuals and groups seeking to address corruption, abuse of power, and institutional dysfunction in various settings beyond education. The Institute's emphasis on evidence-based advocacy, strategic communication, and coalition building had influenced successful reform efforts in healthcare, law enforcement, and government agencies throughout the region. Emma's third book, focusing on the personal resilience and professional skills necessary for sustainable advocacy and reform work, had become a bestseller among activists, educators, and community leaders seeking practical guidance for maintaining effectiveness and emotional health during long-term campaigns for institutional change. Her honest discussion of the personal costs and professional risks involved in challenging powerful interests provided valuable insights for others facing similar situations. The International Conference on Educational Integrity that Emma co-organized with colleagues from universities in Europe and Asia had established her as a globally recognized expert on preventing and addressing corruption in educational institutions. Her presentations on systematic approaches to evidence gathering and accountability mechanisms had influenced policy development in multiple countries facing similar challenges with powerful interests undermining educational quality and equity. The Emma Chun Institute for Social Justice, established through a major gift from technology entrepreneurs who had been inspired by her story, provided a permanent institutional home for research, training, and advocacy related to preventing abuse of power and promoting accountability in public institutions. The Institute's interdisciplinary approach brought together expertise from education, law enforcement, public policy, and social psychology to develop comprehensive solutions to systemic problems. The retirement ceremony for Master Liu Wei at the Dragon's Path Studio had been an emotional celebration of his decades of service to students and his particular pride in Emma's transformation from competitive athlete to educational leader and social justice advocate. His final lesson to Emma and their students emphasized that the highest achievement of martial arts training was not personal victory, but the creation of conditions that allowed others to thrive and develop their own capabilities. Emma's acceptance of the National Education Association's highest honor for lifetime achievement in educational leadership reflected not just her individual accomplishments, but her success in inspiring thousands of other educators to find their own courage and voice in confronting challenges within their institutions. Her acceptance speech emphasized that meaningful change required not heroic individual action, but sustained collective effort by ordinary people willing to take extraordinary risks for principles larger than their own comfort or security. The endowment fund that Emma established to support teachers facing retaliation for reporting misconduct or challenging institutional dysfunction had grown into a substantial resource, providing both financial assistance and legal support for educators in similar situations. The fund's emphasis on documentation, strategic planning, and collaborative advocacy had helped numerous teachers successfully navigate conflicts with powerful interests while maintaining their careers and advancing important reforms. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.